Well, welcome everyone, first of all, to our SPOC forum, and one of our a model for the future. Fingers crossed, if we get the traction and the interest continuing from the group, and we certainly hope so. A little bit of SPOC-related business before we ask Alison to introduce Ben, and that's that the mission of Livery Climate Action Group is now on the website, and the place to find it is on the About page, which is fairly self-evident from the navigation bars on the front of the website. So please have a look and see if you've got any observations. When we meet physically in a forum at the end of June, then we can include that as part of a topic, just to seek formal confirmation by a wider group. But so far it's been crafted by the executive group, I think we're calling it now, Alison, or team, and that's there for interest. And the other thing about the new additions to the website, keep checking regularly on the homepage, because at the foot the new blogs or posts or information about past events are automatically displayed until replaced by the fourth one in the line. And the latest is a blog that Alison wrote about Earth Hour, which was Saturday evening, and a stunning photograph of London, the bridge over the Thames and St Paul's Cathedral, with very, very limited light pollution during Earth Hour, which is really quite encouraging. But we're here this evening to hear more about City of London Corporation's efforts in climate change and resilience. And Alison, you'll introduce our speaker. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Gordon, and thank you all to the SPOCs for joining. There are a few new SPOC faces who have joined since we last had one of these, and it is a bumper turnout. As I said, we've got, I think, 38 people signed up, so thank you very much indeed. It's a testament to the topic, really, I hope. I should perhaps just mention we are recording this presentation, so I hope if you don't mind that. Of course, in a minute I'm going to ask you really all to put your cameras off and obviously to put yourself on mute, because during the presentation, which Ben will be giving with slides, we don't we don't want you sort of jumping up out of the way. So it's absolutely great that we've got Ben here. Now, some of you will remember Ben from our conference in October, when he appeared on the panel talking about biodiversity, but he was one of a panel, and frankly we didn't have enough of him, so we wanted to have him back to talk to us specifically. He is the corporation's environmental resilience officer, and one of the things that you've occasionally said to us is you do want to know more about what the City of London Corporation are doing. Well, in Ben we've got somebody who can tell us about the topic of biodiversity generally, because he's going to give an introduction about what is happening, why it's happening, what sort of legislation and regulation is out there, but also we'll talk about what's literally happening on the streets and in the parks and gardens around you and in the open spaces that the city has. So I think, well, I hope you'll find it very, very interesting and thought-provoking. And some of you, I know, have been involved with biodiversity action locally, or some of you even with the corporation as well. So I think what I'm going to say is we'll hand over to Ben now. We're going to, as I say, put the presentation up. Ben, if you would, perhaps you could try that. Please put your screens off and your voices on mute. We're going to take questions in the chat function, so you can put questions up there at any time that you want, and we will come to those questions at the end when Gordon will be moderating those questions. Ben's going to talk for, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, and we're going to end promptly at 6, so I know you'll be able to get away at that stage, but that means there'll be plenty of time for conversation and chat. So Ben, over to you and your lovely slide. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for having me at your forum. It's really great to be speaking about such an important topic. Secondly, I hope that I will not be too much longer than 15 minutes, but I think on my slide run it went up to half an hour, but I'll try and get through them quicker so that we have more time for questions, because I think that's really the important part here. And as Alison said, questions in the chat, and I think we also agreed if you see a question that you really like the look of, if you give it a like in the chat, we can see which questions are the most popular and we can go to those first. So obviously, I should introduce myself first. So I'm Ben Bishop, as Alison said. I am an Environmental Resilience Officer for the City of London Corporation. My work spans from our key climate action strategy programs, Cool Streets and Greening, and mainstreaming climate resilience. But I also work more broadly across biodiversity objectives within the corporation, supporting planning and development, also working with our natural environment division, who manage 4,400 hectares of open space across London and the South East to look at climate change and resilience and how it impacts our natural capital. So my background, I have a master's in environmental sustainability. I've been working in urban nature conservation specifically for over 8 years, and I am an associate member of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. So happy to take questions about myself, but I think the topic itself has got enough to talk about, so we'll get right into the agenda. So I thought it would be really important. I know that most of us are probably familiar with the concept of biodiversity, but it's always good to start from scratch. So looking at what is biodiversity and why it's important, looking at the legislation and policy drivers, touching on key challenges, key opportunities, having a really specific city view, and then looking at some case studies before I leave you with some takeaway actions and we move into our question and answer session. So what is biodiversity and why is it important in urban areas? Well, most of us think biodiversity, variation of life on Earth, which is correct. So it is the variety and variability of life on Earth, but it's actually measured at different levels. So you have ecosystem diversity, habitat diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. And this is really important because actually what makes biodiversity so important is it is about the variability of all of those things so that they provide different functions and different roles within our global sphere. So actually having a good range of diversity within a gene pool, as well as a good range of diversity of species and habitats, is really important for the wider functioning of our global ecosystem. So how should we view biodiversity? And I think it's really crucial in this day and age that we view biodiversity through this lens of multiple benefits. And it's really important to look at it through our environmental, economical, and social systems. Biodiversity provides what we call ecosystem services. And these services are really important for providing, regulating, supporting, and more broadly, having a better society. So provision of food, raw materials, medicines, fresh water, regulating our climate, our water systems, diseases and pests, moderating extreme weather events, supporting soil formation and soil health, pollination, food chains, nutrient cycling, health and well-being, economic benefits, recreation, and also, more deeply our spiritual values, our religious values, our connection to one another and the world. So it's a really important thing, and it's really important that we look at it through these lenses so that we can begin to value it appropriately. In terms of where we're at globally, nationally, and locally, there's several layers of legislation and policy and targets that kind of set out the sort of pathways for biodiversity restoration. We're in a very nature depleted state globally, but the UK being one of the most nature depleted countries, we're also in a very, very specific situation where there is a need to drive biodiversity conservation and restoration. So starting globally, as you probably will all know, in 1992, we had the Earth Summit opened signatories for the Convention on Biological Diversity with the aim of promoting sustainable use, conserving biological diversity, fair and equitable access to biodiversity, and it came into force in December 1993. Following that, in 2011, we adopted the Aichi targets, which were essentially 5 strategic goals, delivering 20 specific targets, with these strategic goals of addressing and underlying the causes of biodiversity loss, reducing the direct pressures and promoting sustainable use of biodiversity, improving the status of biodiversity, safeguarding ecosystems, species and genetic diversity, enhancing benefits to all, and implementing participatory planning, knowledge and capacity building. And then we moved to the more recent Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties on Biodiversity, setting out the 30 by 30 mission, which is an interim mission for 30% of land and water and ocean being effectively conserved and managed by 2030, and then by 2050 that we are living in prosperity and harmony with biodiversity. So this is a global framework that the signatories of the convention sign up to. So how does that feed into our national efforts? Well, following the first convention, we signed up to our first Biodiversity Action Plan in 1994, which essentially was the UK's first approach of sort of cataloguing and understanding its biological resources, developing detailed plans for biodiversity, threatened species, habitats to aid recovery, and essentially contributing to our global effort of reducing biodiversity loss. And then kind of outside of the sort of sphere of government, we have this independent report or independent review, which was the Lawton Report in 2010. This was a focused report on England specifically, which was essentially a review by Professor Sir John Lawton, who looked at our wildlife sites and their connections, essentially reviewing how degraded our habitat connectivity is in the UK. And essentially the recommendations out of that was that we need to have better protection and management for our nationally designated sites. So that's things like SSIs, special areas of conservation, national nature reserves. We need to look towards establishing ecological restoration zones and better protecting sites that aren't protected. The overarching message was that we needed a bigger, better, more joined up network of sites for biodiversity across the UK. Moving on, we have our 25-year environmental improvement plan, which follows the key targets of including thriving plants and wildlife in our ecosystems, enhancing the natural environment, mitigating and adapting to climate change, and focusing on biosecurity. But most pivotal out of all of these was the Environment Act in 2021, which essentially amended two other key acts of the Town and Country Planning Act and the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act in response to recommendations from the Lawton Review and all the other key drivers of pushing for biological restoration. And essentially it set out key mechanisms for ecological restoration, such as biodiversity net gain, which became mandatory for all developments in England last year, and also set out the framework for delivering nature restoration through setting up 48 strategies across England, which are known as local nature recovery strategies. And these are developed by responsible authorities in partnership with supporting authorities, which is basically all of the local authorities within those strategy areas. And the Greater London one is due to be adopted in 2025. So I will move on because I don't want to hold on too much. But then just moving down to that regional and local perspective, we've obviously got key planning documents. So our London Environment Strategy and the London Plan. As I said, the local nature recovery strategy that's to be adopted in September, the refresh of our green infrastructure framework, which is a framework of how to prioritise and map green infrastructure across London, and then the city's own climate action strategy, which Alison has already touched on, and the biodiversity action plan, which all local authorities have been responsible for delivering since the first UK-wide one. So there's lots of sort of interconnected mechanisms for driving biodiversity restoration at a national, global, national and regional and local level. So I feel the city's in quite a good position to be involved in this now, and we're driving forward, consulting on those regional ones, but also looking towards the future of our local plans and strategies. So I always like to start with threats or challenges because I think it's really important to allow them to frame how we push forward our opportunities. So I see the drivers of decline of biodiversity as these 6 key areas. So you've got changes to land and water use, climate change, resource exploitation, management practices and priorities, pollution, and invasive species. So all of these are key drivers of biodiversity loss in our environment. But I want to pick out 4. So firstly, looking at land and water use. So the image on the right there is an image of the river eroding, and it's my 6th point on this slide, but waterway modification is a key way in which we consider how we're degrading biodiversity. So imagine this was once a waterway with lots of habitats around the side of it going into the water, and now it's completely modified. But primary to this, all of this is leading habitat loss and fragmentation. So deforestation for resource exploitation, degradation of our land through overuse, overexploitation, expanding agriculture, water extraction, they all lead to this sort of primary driver of biodiversity loss, which is reduction in habitat quality, size, and the fragmentation between them. Climate change. So as I work in this field, I see it is a really key driver of biodiversity loss, and primarily through the change in conditions. So actually the temperature rising as a key sort of primary driver of that, leading into these extreme weather events, which might cause things like wildfires. As you can see on screen there, that's actually Wanstead Flats, which is part of Epping Forest, which is subject to wildfire risk and has had some pretty bad wildfire outbreaks in the most recent years. And those are likely to increase with intensity as we see longer droughts, as we see, sort of misuse of sites, contributing and compounding those impacts. Other issues we have are things like altered seasonal cycles. So as we see warmer and milder winters, we're seeing shifts in seasonal patterns. So flowers blooming more earlier, or insects emerging earlier, and their mismatch between their 2 life cycles, which can cause localized biodiversity loss. And also a really interesting topic that is becoming more and more prevalent is this idea that we're going to see increase in human and wildlife conflict, where potentially our habitats, our urban environment continues to encroach on potentially important habitats, but also then becomes a proxy replacement for the habitat that they once needed or once had, because that habitat is either lost or the conditions have changed to a point where they're now using urban environments more than rural or other types of environment. Another area that I work quite a lot in is invasive non-native species, and looking at how they impact London more specifically. And actually, they are a major threat to our native flora and fauna. They outcompete. So within biology, we look at things within their niches. And one of the primary reasons for species loss is competition of other organisms that have now come and filled that niche. Particularly where we see invasive plant species, we're seeing alterations to our habitat, so changing to the actual environmental conditions that make these habitats important. As we're an island, actually disease transmission is quite a key risk from migrating species, so things that are moving more northwards, potentially from the continent, that have maybe got immunity to certain diseases. Hybridization, that doesn't just go for plants. There are multiple species that are subject to this, and if you ever go out with sort of a wetland birder and ask them about the hybridization of ducks, I'm sure they could give you a long a long list of different types that you get from these interactions between non-native and native species. And wholly this all comes back to this food web disruption, so overpredation, outcompeting. So there's a lot of interactions that can happen when we get non-native species. And an example on the screen here, the American mink is a key risk to one of our local native species, the water vole. They were introduced in the early 20th century and are key predators for them. So they're really putting those populations at risk. And then finally, just to bring it back to this more urban perspective, we have management. I think management is a really key impact that we see to biodiversity, especially when we're in these sort of urban and peri-urban spaces. And visitor pressure is one of those key ones. So more and more we're seeing the impact of visitors on sites, especially where we've got really high value sites, where we've got things like ancient woodland and veteran trees. The sort of overuse of sites can lead to compaction and soil erosion and actually damage key habitat features. So there's like a fine balance between accessing nature, which is really important, and actually how we ensure that the reasons that we want to go to these sites, you know, remain. Recreation, so how we use the spaces, as I mentioned previously, things like wildfires can be caused by climate change, but they can also be caused by the way in which we use sites. So things like barbecues and even broken glass have been known to cause wildfires. So it's not necessarily just a barbecue. It can be that you've left some glass on a field and that just sets it off. But other things like, you know, sports activities, dog walking actually is a major impact. So potentially diseases that dogs can carry that might impact livestock managed for conservation. We've got lots of cattle grazing across the city corporation's open spaces. But then also their waste can be an impact to the soil quality and the water quality of our habitats. So it's another thing to consider. And then in terms of management practices, like how we actually manage different things within cycles. So mowing, spraying and clearance are all things that might impact potentially things like pollinators and invertebrates. So mowing too early or mowing too much, spraying obviously pesticides, introducing toxins into the environment, but then also clearing leaf litter. Leaf litter is really important for soil quality and soil health. So removing that can degrade it, but then also it might be a habitat for specific species that might be breaking down that leaf litter. Right, onto opportunities. So how can we deliver nature restoration? What can we do to actually drive it forward? So I see again, 6 key opportunities. As we've already touched on it, but BNG, so delivering and improving habitats through development. So I'm going to expand on it more, but I think that is a really key area of opportunity for us now. Establishing networks and prioritizing areas for action. So actually trying to identify where we can start to connect habitats up and connect spaces between different sites. Technology, I'm a big promoter of using technology to monitor biodiversity, and I'll talk more about that. Reporting, so not necessarily just local authority or authority reporting, but actually reporting on using science-based targets to report on nature-related impacts of businesses. I think it's a really key way of monitoring what's going on. Financing nature, so actually green finance, nature finance, as a way to drive capital investment into biodiversity restoration. And then actually looking at it from this really specific lens of climate adaptation and resilience. You know, we're seeing more and more people are investing in nature-based solutions that are delivering those multiple benefits of biodiversity enhancement, but also regulating urban heat, reducing flood risk, all of those really key benefits. So I wanted to touch on a few of those opportunities. So biodiversity net gain. As we've talked about, it came in under the Environment Act, and it's a proxy essentially for biodiversity within development. So using a baseline, you must deliver 10% more of what you have on site or off site. And it's mandatory for all major developments. There are some exemptions, and then for small sites since April, 2nd of April 2024. So it's a really key mechanism for driving biodiversity improvement within the UK, England specifically. Nature recovery networks. So just on the screen there, we have London's green spaces. So significant amount of green space. And already, if you were to give that map to someone, you could identify some really key networks that could be set up. And as I said, we have the 48 strategies, and the whole purpose of those is to be regionally relevant. So actually regionally, what are the most important habitats? what are the species that we need to target, and how do we focus delivery of better outcomes for them. And then that can be focused down for local application and actually help increase connectivity at a local scale. So as I said, I would talk about it, bioacoustics and artificial intelligence, another key opportunity. And essentially what this enables us to do is remote sense the environment. So using bioacoustics, you can put out a device for as long as you want to sense an environment for as long as you need. And essentially that information can then be processed. And now we have some really good algorithms with a lot of data banks that can kind of back them up, and that can be used to streamline the data collection and analysis process. Currently, it's primarily used for vocal groups, as you might imagine, birdsong, bat calls. But we're seeing more and more now there's development in invertebrate monitoring with bioacoustics and actually looking at vibration frequencies and things that can tell us what is where, maybe through other means of bioacoustic sensing. And then finally, in our sort of opportunities, we're thinking about enhancements. So how can we enhance urban spaces and also provide opportunities for biodiversity? So adaptive landscaping, natural flood management, which I'm going to touch on, and also climate resilient planting. So actually introducing new types of planting that's providing other benefits. Looking at green infrastructure, so green roofs are really, really common now within London and are pretty much within central London and guaranteed within development applications. And we're also seeing an increase in these sustainable urban drainage systems, which are helping manage surface water flood risk. And then finally, using management plans, so trying to figure out how management plans can be part of the way in which we prioritize the multiple things that we need to manage when we're considering how we manage a space. So as part of BNG, development and applicants will have to provide management plans. So that's one way in which management plan will be used, but then even down to the scale of, a set of parks and open spaces within a local authority. How are we managing visitor access? How are we managing biodiversity enhancement? And actually, how do they all align? So, what is happening in the city? So it's a nice skyline shot from Namora International's green roof, which is a biodiverse biosolar roof. So as I've said, we've got some key documents that are coming through and key projects. So we've got our biodiversity action plan, which has 4 key action plan areas, which are open space and habitat management, the built environment, education, and data collection. We have our climate action strategy, which is committed to making our streets and open spaces more resilient to the impacts of climate change, but also through that actually enhancing and conserving biodiversity in these 2 key programs that you can see on screen, the Cool Streets and Greening program and the Carbon Removals program. And then finally, we have our emerging city plan, which is our local plan for the square mile. And there's several policy directives which link those in and actually bring together what we expect through our local policies and our local planning processes. So I thought we couldn't talk about city biodiversity without talking a bit about the data. So within our action plan, we have 7 target species. This is just a data snapshot from the last 4 or 5 years. This data is primarily collected by community groups, and some of it feeds into national monitoring. But as you can see, there's a disparity in which areas of data that are being collected and potentially where there might not be necessarily species being recorded. So potentially more action needs to take place. But essentially, this information can start to help us prioritize action and understand whether these are the right target species. These were set in 2021. Should we still focus action on these groups? Is this relevant to our dense urban environment? And we get all of this data through our service level agreement with Green Space Information for Greater London, which is essentially the local record centre for London. We have got some more targeted efforts to monitor pollinators going on in the city. So over the last 3 to 4 years, we've had a really big increase in pollinator monitoring activity through several different key stakeholders, from individuals managing green spaces to community groups like Friends of City Gardens, and Livery action groups like Pollinating London Together. So actually it's really key time, and I think pollinators as a topic and a target for urban areas is really relevant. It's actually so important for us to think about how our urban green spaces, as potentially really useful hubs of biodiversity for pollinators, are providing the resources that they need. From that, our biodiversity action plan manager has set up a new action group, which is about pollinators and is led by PLT, who are essentially helping guide the way in what we do for pollinators. And we've recently put together a guidance document for green space and building managers to kind of inform them in what they can be doing, what they should be considering for different types of pollinator, not just bees, but moths, butterflies, beetles, all key pollinators. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a quick snapshot on more detailed data. So this is some data for the last sort of almost 10 years on bumblebee populations within the city. And as you can see, really what it's showing is there's not that many records compared to sort of the records of honeybees, but also that we have a spike in 2020. So we've got some really consistent data collection starting to happen around 2019, and hopefully what we'll see is that will increase, so we'll be able to get a better picture of what's going on. But really that picture there can give us an idea of what we maybe need to think about in terms of targeting efforts, action, maybe even engagements with wider stakeholders. So I did say I would give you some case studies, so let's move on to case studies. First case study, which I think obviously I can't come on this call without speaking about Cool Streets and Greening, which is the program that I help coordinate. It's one of our major climate action strategy projects. It's a 4-phase program, so it has 4 phases, and it's £6.8 million program, which essentially the city has agreed through its climate action strategy to invest in making our streets more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And just on there is one of our completed projects at Cheapside, One New Change. The Cool Streets and Greening program's core aim is to increase greening, and essentially the reason we want to increase greening is to mitigate urban heat, alleviate surface water flood risk, and enhance biodiversity and connectivity. So key projects on the screen, we've got the City of London Boys School Riverside Garden, which was one of our first projects, which was about xeriscaping, so gardening without water, with limited water. And essentially that trialed a range of different mulches and environments for planting, and I think it's been really successful. It's established really well. This picture is actually from 2 weeks ago, so this is in March. So I think by summer, this plant here, it's called an echium. It will be about up here. There'll be bees all over it. We've also had a really sort of intensive investigation of our streets to kind of prioritize where we can put street trees. So you can see 2 in the picture there. It's quite a difficult challenge because we've got such congested streets, underground constraints. So it's been quite difficult, but we've got a good idea of where we can put them now. And then we've also got St Mary Aldermanbury by the Guildhall, which is a replanting project where we had a horticultural expert redesign the garden to increase pollinator-friendly planting, to trial different types of resilient planting, and I think it's been really successful. And it's one of the few gardens where you'll just see year-round flowering plants, which is really important for pollinators. So key achievements to date: we've planted over 60 street trees, completed 26 projects, and we've improved around 10,000 square meters of green space for the city. Being quite a small administrative area, that's quite significant. So, and we're only on our we've got 2 more years of the program, 2 more full financial years. So that gives you an idea of how much more we could still achieve. Our second case study, so I've already spoken a bit about it, but it's bioacoustics in the city. So we've worked with 2 key stakeholders to implement bioacoustics in the city. And as I explained earlier, it's a remote sensing form where we can remote sense the different species around us. So firstly, we worked with Imperial College London to pilot bioacoustics within urban environments for policy development and actually to support emerging research on green roofs. So we wanted to see how valuable green roofs are as a proxy for green space within urban environments. Like, are they providing the same amount of biodiversity value within the city? And then secondly, thirdly, we wanted to trial a citywide implementation. So we're trialing these agri-sound polysensors, which essentially tell us the number of bumblebees visiting a garden through detecting their vibrations. So hopefully we can see, as our replanting projects continue, we'll be able to start to see the improvements of the sites as we continue to implement more projects. This is an outer city case study, but it's still a City of London case study. So as I mentioned before, how can we have adaptive landscapes? Well, natural flood management is one of those ways. And essentially our natural flood management project was in partnership with the conservation team at Epping Forest and the London Borough of Waltham Forest. The aim was to manage floodwater to reduce residential flooding. So there was a flood risk area at the bottom of one of the hills that goes out of the forest into Waltham Forest to reduce drought risk and to improve veteran tree resilience. So although the flood risk wasn't the responsibility of the City of London Corporation, because we aren't the lead local flood authority for Waltham Forest, we saw the key value of actually implementing these are called leaky dams, in it to help us infiltrate water. So essentially, as we see the climate continuing to change, we're expecting higher levels of drought, higher drought stress on things like veteran trees, which Epping Forest is really important for. And as we sort of implement these, we'll see more water in the ground and better root health, tree health, and essentially have multiple benefits coming out for biodiversity, as veteran trees are essentially like islands of biodiversity. They're really important habitat features. And then finally, I wanted to look at a sort of another local authority's plans. So Hackney has generated their local nature recovery plan, and essentially they've set up this key spatial framework for their borough. So they've beat the Greater London Authority at developing the local nature recovery plan for their area, but what they've done is essentially set up this spatial framework which enables them to start to set priorities for areas. So they've got 5 key areas of change, and this, you can see how this works with development, because you start to see how this aligns with the planning process and development process. You know, when you develop your local plan, you have key areas of change, and it really helps align driving nature opportunities. Rather than just having an action plan for biodiversity, you have an action plan with a spatial framework that helps drive that. So I think it's a really key thing, and I think it's what we need to move towards, and it's something that we're considering as part of the Biodiversity Action Plan refresh post 2026. So nearly done. Wanted to kind of go on to key takeaways. So what can you do? And I think it's quite clear, you know, there's a lot to consider, there's a lot to cover, there's all sorts of areas of interest, and it's about taking something away that you can maybe do either in your personal life or in your professional life. So I think both in your personal and professional life, you know, you can be reviewing your impacts and considering biodiversity in all activities. You know, I think thinking about the impact assessment approach to business is really important. How can you reduce like your local impact to biodiversity, but then also how can you reduce your global impact to biodiversity? You know, I think some of the biggest biodiversity losses are at a global scale, where we need more resources, where we're, deforesting and, that sort of stuff. I think supporting nature recovery, and I think supporting it at a local level. So adopting either your own sort of actions that can feed into either a local plan or a regional plan. As I mentioned previously, driving nature finance and green finance opportunities. There are many ways now that you can disclose your impacts, and I think the task force for nature related disclosures is really important for that. Taking action, I think volunteering and actually getting to know your local flora and fauna is just as important as saying to your CEO, we need to do something about this, like we need to have an impact assessment on our footprint, ecological footprint. And that goes back to education. So actually knowing what you can do, knowing what is important, so that your teams, your senior officers are consider and understand how what you do might impact biodiversity. So I would like to say thank you for listening to me, and hopefully you have lots of questions.
Many thanks indeed, Ben. That was terrific. I think if you can stop sharing your screen, we can all reassemble in the gallery. And thanks, folks, for populating the Q&A. I think that can get us going. And I'll take note of the thumbs up, although it's not essential. I think we'll get through them all. I started it off, Ben, and forgive me if some of them were later answered in your presentation. That's the danger of putting a question in quickly. How are planners on board? Are you seeing planning applications now that properly recognise biodiversity, or do you still have to fight for it and point to the legislation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're getting there. So especially within the city plan, which is now at a stage where people can review it. It is online and it's going through its inspections right now. So it's quite an important time for it. In terms of planners, I feel the city's planners are definitely on board. I think there's a swathe across London and possibly across the UK of where planning authorities sit with this, and I think how it impacts other outcomes. For example, I mean, the city doesn't have the same problem, but how do we meet house building targets and still ensure that we retain really important areas of habitat, that we make sure that there is reasonable biodiversity net gain within a development, whether it be on site or off site. And I think developers, especially within the city, have bought into our proposed policy approach. So we're not doing 10% in the city, we're doing a 3 unit per hectare. So every hectare of the footprint of the building you will need to, once the policy is adopted, deliver 3 units of biodiversity within the statutory biodiversity metric. And they're already putting these proposals through. Are they always as clear cut and honest as they can be? I think that's subject to discussion. I was looking at a proposal which was saying that the building was providing a type of habitat, extensive green roof, within another policy framework which is called urban greening. And my mentor and I were looking through it, and we decided we don't think that they're delivering that. They're actually delivering a planter which isn't within that, which isn't classified. So they're providing more benefits, but they're not actually delivering them.
Interesting. Thanks, Ben. Peter of the Fan Makers, can you unmute yourself? Because we're not in a webinar format. We can ask our own questions. And you've got a couple next on my list.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Ben. That was very engaging, very interesting. An area I'm really interested in. There was a couple of different ones here. I'm familiar with actually a programme in Scotland. And the first phase of that programme is to remove the invasive species for native species to then thrive or to return. I wonder if that applies to the City of London as a philosophy.
Yes, it definitely does. And I think where you've got that landscape scale restoration as you can have in Scotland, you can really target what you're trying to do. I think within urban environments, the city being a key example of a very dense urban environment, you have potentially issues of introduced shrub and plant that are going to become invasive now or potentially in future climates. So I think we have to think about it with two perspectives. In urban areas, introducing native species in landscaping isn't necessarily always going to work because the environment is more challenging. It's not the same environment as you get out in like a heathland or a woodland. It's much more constrained. So we do continue to use cultivated and non-native plants to create, good benefits to biodiversity and people. In terms of encouraging native species to re-establish, within the London Local Nature Recovery Strategy and within wider ones, probably across the UK, there is a key area of looking at reintroductions. So across London, there's two key initiatives. There's reintroducing beavers, which obviously are key keystone species and driving landscape change, and then reintroducing white storks as well, potentially at wetland areas. So I think they are, I mean, as you probably have seen, the beavers have worked in some areas. The white stork, I think it's still TBC how that's going to work. But then,
interesting, because they have impact on so many other following species, don't they? There's keystone species, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But then something that we've put forward for reintroductions is actually how we manage sites. So we're reintroducing grazing fauna. So we use grazing cattle at Epping Forest. We use grazing cattle on our commons in the south, so Coulsdon Commons, and at Burnham Beeches, and they're really important for managing what we call wood pasture habitat and chalk downland, which are really important priority habitats for the UK. So there's that type of
interesting, complex picture, isn't it? I mean,
Peter, if you could hold your next question, and I'll get back to you, but try and cover as many people in the room as possible. Of course, no problem at all. And looking down the thumbs up as well. Kate, could you come in now with your question about agriculture and the tensions there between habitat loss and biodiversity? Kate Aldridge from the Tylers, I think, and Bricklayers.
Hi, thank you for bringing me in. Yes, I was asking a question about animal agriculture, given it's a leading driver of deforestation and habitat loss and biodiversity decline generally. And I just quoted that in the UK alone, as far as I understand, 80% of the farmland is used for animal agriculture, whether it's the animals or the crops that are grown for feeding the animals, which is 60% of UK land. So obviously huge opportunities there to, if we reduce the amount of land we were using for animal product consumption, there would be a whole load more land freed up for nature. So I was wondering, I appreciate this is kind of, the focus is on, biodiversity within the city, but just thinking about the footprint of the city, I was wondering if there were any opportunities for the city to lead the way in promoting plant-based food to help protect nature further afield.
I'll start with that point and I'll go backwards maybe, because I think that's a really key. I don't want to lose that point in the question, but I think the city corporation as a fairly well-sized corporation organization and other large organizations do really have a part to play in where they put their money and what they choose to invest in. So if we focus on having a plant-based, say, offering for like our corporate events, or and we do that and we show where our direction is in terms of how we spend our money, then I think there is a way in which we can promote that. We do have some agricultural land within our portfolio, so within Epping Forest primarily, where there is buffer land for protecting the forest from development. Whether that's so, some of that land is now being taken out of agricultural use, so you have to redesignate the use of the land, and you have to make you have to either remove the site user through an agreement. And we recently converted an agricultural plot within the bufferlands to wildflower hay meadow. It was actually used it was meant to be crop growing land, so it wasn't animal agriculture, but the the rationale really to justify removing food production land was the soil quality just wasn't there, like it wasn't good food growing land. So actually, why would you continue to use that? So I think there's also that way of looking at potentially justifying, is this the right use of space, and aligning it that way. And then I think regenerative farming practices are really going to be the key in which we can unlock those opportunities. So there are some interesting agricultural projects across the UK that are looking at how they reduce the amount of space that they take up for crop production. In terms of animal agriculture, I'm not as familiar with activities. There is one that I can recall from a couple of years ago where they changed the type of cows that they were managing and to more of a traditional breed, I think. I would have to check on that and what that was actually doing. But I think a lot of farmers now, they're leaving a lot of edge stripping. So instead of doing a full cut of their crops, actually it makes more sense. It saves petrol, it saves whatever it is to just do that sort of key area without having to go backwards and forwards. So there's a lot of practices, and I think really the benefits are going to speak for themselves. Those farmers that are choosing to prioritize biodiversity within their practices are going to see better soil quality, better resilience to pests, diseases of their crops, and also drought stress and all of those other benefits that having diverse root systems and complex floral diversity is going to provide. So, I think those who choose not to go that way will and ultimately suffer. And I think, yeah, animal agriculture is something that needs to take that into account as well.
Good answer, Ben. Thanks. Una, could I ask you to come in with your question, and then just to tee up our next one, Andy, that would be afterwards, so you can be unmuted ready later. But Una from the constructors.
Sure. Hi, hello everyone. I wanted more to check on the steps later on and what's the plans. So my question is, sorry, I will need to read it again. Given the national efforts to date, how can we ensure that the future frameworks are more effective in reversing biodiversity loss?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the key is monitoring, so actually understanding what we have in terms of biodiversity, natural capital, because I think we have within the UK, we have a fairly good idea of what our key habitats, species are. But what we really need to know is where they're at. So recently, a project was undertaken by the London Natural History Society to review the key London floral list. So actually, we're thinking of like large mammals, we're thinking of birds, we're thinking of beaver reintroductions, but actually the work wasn't there for plant diversity within London, and actually looking at the priority plant species within London and where they were, say, 20 years ago and where they are now, and how much that has changed. So that effort has allowed us to use that data to inform the London local nature recovery strategy and target specific habitat types. I think with all national efforts, there needs to be really concise and robust local efforts, and I think you see it across London and other local authorities, the amount that don't have a biodiversity action plan adopted, or even an ecologist that can coordinate that effort. So really what we need is we need money. We need the government to invest more money in those particular outcomes and posts that can help drive biodiversity restoration and skills. There's a BNG is an example of where we have a massive skills gap because it's such a new tool that no one really knows what's going to happen in 10 years with it, and actually what the outcomes are going to be in the 30-year period that it is in force for new habitats created.
Great, thanks, Ben. Andy, you've got a choice here. You've got pick one of your favorite question and put to Ben. Probably doubt if we'll have time for all of them.
Ben, I don't know if this is in your pay grade, but what do we do as local councillors to stop grey belt being built on? Oh, it's not green belt anymore, it's grey belt. Now, I do accept that there are probably some parts of the green belt that, are a former caravan site or something. It doesn't look very natural. But but I really see it as the thin end of the wedge, because once you build a whopping great housing estate on there and put all the infrastructure in it, the areas around that are suddenly going to become grey belt. And I really see this as the end of the green belt, really. I think that we're going to see a lot of housing being built on the edge of London, and that's going to erode the areas of genuine green belt that we do have. And I feel a bit of a loss, really, because the government in general is overriding local councils' planning objections, even removing their right to object. And I feel quite powerless sometimes as to stop development that is obviously going to be damaging our nature.
Yeah, no, so certainly is. And I think it's a really complex one, because you've got that sort of tension between local policy and national policy, and local government and national government direction. But I think the key is that we have to have a really strong national planning policy framework that works and takes these considerations into a weighted account. I don't think I really have the answer, but I do feel, from my perspective, having worked in London in conservation for the last 8 years, that a lot of London's outer green areas, in most areas, have good designations protecting them. So obviously Epping Forest is a triple SI. All of the the chalk downlands of like Croydon and Surrey, they're effectively going to be squeezed by the small pockets of less important habitat. And I think it's about hopefully using the local nature recovery strategy, which it does do this, and when it's released, it should do this, identify those nature recovery opportunities and essentially put them into a pipeline of, projects or, opportunities that essentially biodiversity net gain should prioritize and actually will be more valuable to delivering. So there's it's called a multiplier. So if you have maybe a bit of wasteland between a triple SI and a SAC, that wasteland, if a developer put credits onto it or units onto it, would get more outcome. So they would effectively have to pay less to deliver biodiversity net gain. If they couldn't do it on their site, they have to try and do it on their site first. So there's that. And I do think with new development, if they're doing on site, hopefully they're going to continue to deliver biodiversity, but it's a really tricky topic, and probably yes, above my pay grade.
Thanks, man. No, not at all. Would you be happy to answer the questions that we haven't had time to ask you, because I need to hand over to Alison now for closing word. We like to give Alison the last word, and but there's important messages on dates for your diary that Alison will pass.
Yeah, I've looked through the questions, Ben. I think they wouldn't be too taxing, I hope, just to do a few words. So maybe I'll send them to you and I can then send them round to folks. But Ben, honestly, so brilliant to put all that context so that we weren't just jumping straight into what I wanted to hear about, which was all the bioacoustic stuff and things, but really the context. And it's really important. And I think to answer one of the questions, the London, whatever it is, nature recovery plan, which we as the city will be part of, will actually, bring stuff together in that wider sphere. So that will be fantastic. So Ben, many thanks for your knowledge and for your commitment to all of this around the city. It's fantastic. You do work very, very hard with PLT and things. So I'm asking you to put your cameras on, because so don't go yet, please, because Stuart's going to take a photo of us, if you don't mind. But there are 2 dates coming up. The next meeting like this is going to be, again, another guest speaker event. So we're going to be talking about, let me get the name, carbon calculation and mitigation. 20 odd of you have already signed up. So it's clearly going to be another interesting event. That's on May the 19th. It's at 5 o'clock for another hour. But then the big thing that's coming up, I suppose, is we are going to have an in-person all SPOC meeting on June the 24th. You'll already have the date in your diary, because Livery members will know it's when we elect the new sheriffs. But after we've elected the sheriffs, after we've all had lunch wherever, at 3:30, I want you to come to the All SPOC annual general meeting and discussion. And it's going to be very much focused on what the liveries are doing. In fact, if Anne were able to come on, she might tell me what it's called, but it's about livery innovation and resilience. So it's going to be great. We're going to be taking the whole food issue further forward as well, Kate, you'll be pleased to know. So those are two great dates coming up. We're going to send around the slides. We're going to send around the pollinator paper that Ben mentioned to you. And we'll be obviously sending reminders about the other events. So quickly, anybody else want to come on screen before Stuart takes a photo? Alan, Gary, Angus, I think it is, Sasha. No, Una, are you coming on?
Yeah, it's not working.
No, okay, right. Anybody else? And quickly we'll say then goodbye to folks. Wave to Stuart and wave goodbye to Ben. Thank you very much. I hope that's okay. And the recording's going to go up as well. So much to look forward to. Thank you all for your help and for attending. It's great.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Lots of claps around the place. So thank you. Right.
Thank you very much.
Closing down because we like to be true to our 6 o'clock deadline. Thank you all very much indeed for your questions. And the others will get answered. I'll get them to Ben, get them back to you.